Chapters 25 and 26 of Don Quixote Volume 2. Chapter 25, wherein is set down the braying adventure, and the droll one of the puppet showman, together with the memorable divinations of the divining ape. Don Quixote's bread would not bake, as the common saying is, until he had heard and learned the curious things promised by the man who carried the arms. He went to seek him where the innkeeper said he was, and having found him, bade him say now at any rate what he had to say in answer to the question he had asked him on the road. "The tale of my wonders must be taken more leisurely, and not standing," said the man. "Let me finish foddering my beast, good sir, and then I'll tell you things that will astonish you." "Don't wait for that," said Don Quixote. "I'll help you in everything." And so he did, sifting the barley for him and cleaning out the manger, a degree of humility which made the other feel bound to tell him, with a good grace, what he had asked. So seating himself on a bench, with Don Quixote beside him, and the cousin, the page, Sancho Panza, and the landlord, for a senate and an audience, he began his story in this way. You must know that in a village 4 leagues and a half from this inn, it so happened that one of the regidors, by the tricks and roguery of a servant girl of his, it's too long a tale to tell, lost an ass, and though he did all he possibly could to find it, it was all to no purpose. A fortnight might have gone by, so the story goes, since the ass had been missing, when, as the regidor who had lost it was standing in the plaza, another regidor of the same town said to him, "Pay me for good news, gossip, your ass has turned up." "That I will, and well, gossip," said the other, "but tell us, where has he turned up?" "In the forest," said the finder. "I saw him this morning without pack saddle or harness of any sort, and so lean that it went to one's heart to see him. I tried to drive him before me to bring him to you, but he is already so wild and shy that when I went near him he made off into the thickest part of the forest. If you have a mind that we two should go back and look for him, let me put up this she-ass at my house, and I'll be back at once." "You will be doing me a great kindness," said the owner of the ass, "and I'll try to pay it back in the same coin." It is with all these circumstances, and in the very same way I am telling it now, that those who know all about the matter tell the story. Well then, the 2 regidors set off on foot, arm in arm, for the forest, and coming to the place where they hoped to find the ass, they could not find him, nor was he to be seen anywhere about, search as they might. Seeing then that there was no sign of him, the regidor who had seen him said to the other, "Look here, gossip, a plan has occurred to me, by which, beyond a doubt, we shall manage to discover the animal, even if he is stowed away in the bowels of the earth, not to say the forest. Here it is. I can bray to perfection, and if you can ever so little, the thing's as good as done." "Ever so little, did you say, gossip?" said the other. "By God, I'll not give in to anybody, not even to the asses themselves." "We'll soon see," said the second regidor, "for my plan is that you should go to one side of the forest, and I the other, so as to go all round about it; and every now and then you will bray, and I will bray, and it cannot be but the ass will hear us, and answer us if he is in the forest." To which the owner of the ass replied, "It's an excellent plan, I declare, gossip, and worthy of your great genius." And the 2 separating as agreed, it so fell out that they brayed almost at the same moment, and each, deceived by the braying of the other, ran to look, fancying the ass had turned up at last. When they came in sight of one another, said the loser, "Is it possible, gossip, that it was not my ass that brayed?" "No, it was I," said the other. "Well then, I can tell you, gossip," said the ass's owner, "that between you and an ass there is not an atom of difference as far as braying goes, for I never in all my life saw or heard anything more natural." "Those praises and compliments belong to you more justly than to me, gossip," said the inventor of the plan; "for, by the God that made me, you might give a couple of brays odds to the best and most finished brayer in the world. The tone you have got is deep, your voice is well kept up as to time and pitch, and your finishing notes come thick and fast. In fact, I own myself beaten, and yield the palm to you, and give in to you in this rare accomplishment." "Well then," said the owner, "I'll set a higher value on myself for the future, and consider that I know something, as I have an excellence of some sort. For though I always thought I brayed well, I never supposed I came up to the pitch of perfection you say. And I say too, said the second, that there are rare gifts going to loss in the world, and that they are ill bestowed upon those who don't know how to make use of them. Ours, said the owner of the ass, unless it is in cases like this that we have now in hand, cannot be of any service to us, and even in this God grant they may be of some use. So saying they parted, and took to their braying once more, but every instant they were deceiving one another, and coming to meet one another again, until they arranged by way of countersign, so as to know that it was they and not the ass, to give 2 brays one after the other. In this way, doubling the brays at every step, they made the complete circuit of the forest, but the lost ass never gave them an answer, or even the sign of one. How could the poor ill-starred brute have answered, when, in the thickest part of the forest, they found him devoured by wolves? As soon as he saw him, his owner said, I was wondering he did not answer, for if he wasn't dead he'd have brayed when he heard us, or he'd have been no ass. But for the sake of having heard you bray to such perfection, gossip, I count the trouble I have taken to look for him well bestowed, even though I have found him dead. It's in a good hand, gossip, said the other. If the abbot sings well, the acolyte is not much behind him. So they returned disconsolate and hoarse to their village, where they told their friends, neighbors, and acquaintances what had befallen them in their search for the ass, each crying up the other's perfection in braying. The whole story came to be known and spread abroad through the villages of the neighborhood, and the devil, who never sleeps, with his love for sowing dissensions and scattering discord everywhere, blowing mischief about and making quarrels out of nothing, contrived to make the people of the other towns fall to braying whenever they saw anyone from our village, as if to throw the braying of our regidors in our teeth. Then the boys took to it, which was the same thing for it as getting into the hands and mouths of all the devils of hell, and braying spread from one town to another in such a way that the men of the braying town are as easy to be known as blacks are to be known from whites, and the unlucky joke has gone so far that several times the scoffed have come out in arms in a body to do battle with the scoffers, and neither king nor rook, fear nor shame, can mend matters. Tomorrow or the day after, I believe, the men of my town, that is, of the braying town, are going to take the field against another village 2 leagues away from ours, one of those that persecute us most. And that we may turn out well prepared, I have bought these lances and halberds you have seen. These are the curious things I told you I had to tell, and if you don't think them so, I have got no others. And with this the worthy fellow brought his story to a close. Just at this moment there came in at the gate of the inn a man entirely clad in chamois leather, hose, breeches, and doublet, who said in a loud voice, Señor host, have you room? Here's the divining ape and the show of the release of Melisendra just coming. Odds body, said the landlord, why, it's Master Pedro. We're in for a grand night. I forgot to mention that the said Master Pedro had his left eye and nearly half his cheek covered with a patch of green taffety, showing that something ailed all that side. Your worship is welcome, Master Pedro, continued the landlord, but where are the ape and the show, for I don't see them? They are close at hand, said he in the chamois leather, but I came on first to know if there was any room. I'd make the Duke of Alva himself clear out to make room for Master Pedro, said the landlord. Bring in the ape and the show. There's company in the inn tonight that will pay to see that and the cleverness of the ape. So be it by all means, said the man with the patch. I'll lower the price, and be well satisfied if I only pay my expenses. And now I'll go back and hurry on the cart with the ape and the show. And with this he went out of the inn. Don Quixote at once asked the landlord what this Master Pedro was, and what was the show, and what was the ape he had with him. Which the landlord replied, This is a famous puppet showman, who for some time past has been going about this Mancha de Aragon, exhibiting a show of the release of Melisendra by the famous Don Gaiferos, one of the best and best represented stories that we have seen in this part of the kingdom for many a year. He has also with him an ape of the most extraordinary gift ever seen in an ape or imagined in a human being, for if you ask him anything, he listens attentively to the question, and then jumps on his master's shoulder, and pressing close to his ear tells him the answer which Master Pedro then delivers. He says a great deal more about things past than about things to come, and though he does not always hit the truth in every case, most times he is not far wrong, so that he makes us fancy he has got the devil in him. He gets 2 reals for every question if the ape answers. I mean if his master answers for him after he has whispered into his ear. And so it is believed that this same Master Pedro is very rich. He is a gallant man, as they say in Italy, and good company, and leads the finest life in the world, talks more than 6, drinks more than a dozen, and all by his tongue, and his ape, and his show. Master Pedro now came back, and in a cart followed the show and the ape, a big one, without a tail, and with buttocks as bare as felt, but not vicious looking. As soon as Don Quixote saw him, he asked him, "Can you tell me, Sir Fortune Teller, what fish do we catch, and how it will be with us? See, here are my 2 reals." And he bade Sancho to give them to Master Pedro. But he answered for the ape, and said, "Señor, this animal does not give any answer or information touching things that are to come. Of things past he knows something, and more or less of things present." "Gad," said Sancho, "I would not give a farthing to be told what's past with me, for who knows that better than I do myself? And to pay for being told what I know would be mighty foolish. But as you know things present, here are my 2 reals, and tell me, most excellent Sir Ape, what is my wife Teresa Panza doing now, and what is she diverting herself with?" Master Pedro refused to take the money, saying, "I will not receive payment in advance, or until the service has been first rendered." And then with his right hand he gave a couple of slaps on his left shoulder, and with one spring the ape perched himself upon it, and putting his mouth to his master's ear began chattering his teeth rapidly. And having kept this up as long as one would be saying a credo, with another spring he brought himself to the ground, and at the same instant Master Pedro ran in great haste, and fell upon his knees before Don Quixote, and embracing his legs exclaimed, "These legs do I embrace as I would embrace the 2 pillars of Hercules, O illustrious reviver of knight-errantry, so long consigned to oblivion! O never yet duly extolled knight, Don Quixote of La Mancha, courage of the faint-hearted, prop of the tottering, arm of the fallen, staff and counsel of all who are unfortunate." Don Quixote was thunderstruck, Sancho astounded, the cousin staggered, the page astonished, the man from the braying town agape, the landlord in perplexity, and in short everyone amazed at the words of the puppet showman, who went on to say, "And thou, worthy Sancho Panza, the best squire and squire to the best knight in the world, be of good cheer, for thy good wife Teresa is well, and she is at this moment hackling a pound of flax; and more, by token she has at her left hand a jug with a broken spout that holds a good drop of wine, with which she solaces herself at her work." "That I can well believe," said Sancho. "She is a lucky one, and if it was not for her jealousy I would not change her for the giantess Andadona, who by my master's account was a very clever and worthy woman. My Teresa is one of those that won't let themselves want for anything, though their heirs may have to pay for it." "Now I declare," said Don Quixote, "he who reads much and travels much sees and knows a great deal. I say so because what amount of persuasion could have persuaded me that there are apes in the world that can divine as well as I have seen now with my own eyes? For I am that very Don Quixote of La Mancha this worthy animal refers to, though he has gone rather too far in my praise. But whatever I may be, I thank heaven that it has endowed me with a tender and compassionate heart, always disposed to do good to all and harm to none." "If I had money," said the page, "I would ask Señor Ape what will happen me in the peregrination I am making." To this Master Pedro, who had by this time risen from Don Quixote's feet, replied, "I have already said that this little beast gives no answer as to the future; but if he did, not having money would be of no consequence, for to oblige Señor Don Quixote here present, I would give up all the profits in the world. And now, because I have promised it, and to afford him pleasure, I will set up my show and offer entertainment to all who are in the inn, without any charge whatever." As soon as he heard this, the landlord, delighted beyond measure, pointed out a place where the show might be fixed, which was done at once. Don Quixote was not very well satisfied with the divinations of the ape, as he did not think it proper that an ape should divine anything, either past or future. So while Master Pedro was arranging the show, he retired with Sancho into a corner of the stable, where, without being overheard by anyone, he said to him, "Look here, Sancho, I have been seriously thinking over this ape's extraordinary gift, and have come to the conclusion that beyond doubt this Master Pedro, his master, has a pact, tacit or express, with the devil." "If the packet is express from the devil," said Sancho, "it must be a very dirty packet, no doubt. But what good can it do Master Pedro to have such packets?" "Thou dost not understand me, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "I only mean he must have made some compact with the devil to infuse this power into the ape, that he may get his living, and after he has grown rich he will give him his soul, which is what the enemy of mankind wants. This I am led to believe by observing that the ape only answers about things past or present, and the devil's knowledge extends no further, for the future he knows only by guesswork, and that not always; for it is reserved for God alone to know the times and the seasons, and for him there is neither past nor future; all is present. This being as it is clear that this ape speaks by the spirit of the devil, and I am astonished they have not denounced him to the Holy Office, and put him to the question, and forced it out of him by whose virtue it is that he divines; because it is certain this ape is not an astrologer, neither his master nor he sets up, nor knows how to set up, those figures they call judiciary, which are now so common in Spain that there is not a jade, or page, or old cobbler, that will not undertake to set up a figure as readily as pick up a knave of cards from the ground, bringing to naught the marvellous truth of the science by their lies and ignorance. I know of a lady who asked one of these figure schemers whether her little lapdog would be in pup, and would breed, and how many and of what colour the little pups would be; to which señor astrologer, after having set up his figure, made answer that the bitch would be in pup, and would drop 3 pups, one green, another bright red, and the third party coloured, provided she conceived between 11 and 12 either of the day or night, and on a Monday or Saturday; but as things turned out, 2 days after this the bitch died of a surfeit, and Señor Planet Ruler had the credit all over the place of being a most profound astrologer, as most of these planet rulers have. "Still," said Sancho, "I would be glad if your worship would make Master Pedro ask the ape whether what happened your worship in the cave of Montesinos is true, for, begging your worship's pardon, I, for my part, take it to have been all flam and lies, or at any rate something you dreamt." "That may be," replied Don Quixote; "however, I do what you suggest, though I have my own scruples about it." At this point Master Pedro came up in quest of Don Quixote, to tell him his show was now ready, and to come and see it, for it was worth seeing. Don Quixote explained his wish, and begged him to ask his ape at once to tell him whether certain things which had happened to him in the cave of Montesinos were dreams or realities, for to him they appeared to partake of both. Upon this Master Pedro, without answering, went back to fetch the ape, and, having placed it in front of Don Quixote and Sancho, said, "See here, Señor Ape, this gentleman wishes to know whether certain things which happened to him in the cave called the cave of Montesinos were false or true." On his making the usual sign the ape mounted on his left shoulder and seemed to whisper in his ear, and Master Pedro said at once, "The ape says that the things you saw or what happened to you in that cave are, part of them false, part true, and that he only knows this and no more as regards this question; but if your worship wishes to know more, on Friday next he will answer all that may be asked him, for his virtue is at present exhausted, and will not return to him till Friday, as he has said." "Did I not say, señor," said Sancho, "that I could not bring myself to believe that all your worship said about the adventures in the cave was true, or even the half of it?" "The course of events will tell, Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "Time, that discloses all things, leaves nothing that it does not drag into the light of day, though it be buried in the bosom of the earth. But enough of that for the present; let us go and see Master Pedro's show, for I am sure there must be something novel in it." "Something!" said Master Pedro; "this show of mine has 60,000 novel things in it. Let me tell you, Señor Don Quixote, It is one of the best worth seeing things in the world this day. But operibus credite et non verbis, and now let's get to work, for it is growing late, and we have a great deal to do and to say and show." Don Quixote and Sancho obeyed him, and went to where the show was already put up and uncovered, set all around with lighted wax tapers, which made it look splendid and bright. When they came to it, Master Pedro ensconced himself inside it, for it was he who had to work the puppets, and a boy, a servant of his, posted himself outside to act as showman and explain the mysteries of the exhibition, having a wand in his hand to point to the figures as they came out. And so, all who were in the inn being arranged in front of the show, some of them standing, and Don Quixote, Sancho, the page, and cousin, accommodated with the best places, the interpreter began to say what he will hear or see who reads or hears the next chapter. Chapter 26, wherein is continued the droll adventure of the puppet showman, together with other things in truth right good. All were silent, Tyrians and Trojans. I mean all who were watching the show were hanging on the lips of the interpreter of its wonders, when drums and trumpets were heard to sound inside it, and cannon to go off. The noise was soon over, and then the boy lifted up his voice and said, "This true story which is here represented to your worships is taken word for word from the French chronicles and from the Spanish ballads that are in everybody's mouth, and in the mouth of the boys about the streets. Its subject is the release by Señor Don Gaiferos of his wife Melisendra, when a captive in Spain at the hands of the Moors in the city of Sansuena, for so they called then what is now called Saragossa. And there you may see how Don Gaiferos is playing at the tables, just as they sang it. At tables playing Don Gaiferos sits, for Melisendra is forgotten now. And that personage who appears there with a crown on his head and a scepter in his hand is the Emperor Charlemagne, the supposed father of Melisendra, who, angered to see his son-in-law's inaction and unconcern, comes in to chide him. And observe with what vehemence and energy he chides him, so that you would fancy he was going to give him half a dozen raps with his scepter, and indeed there are authors who say he did give them, and sound ones too, and after having said a great deal to him about imperilling his honour by not effecting the release of his wife, he said, so the tale runs, "Enough I've said, see to it now." Observe too how the emperor turns away and leaves Don Gaiferos fuming, and you see now how in a burst of anger he flings the table and board far from him, and calls in haste for his armour, and asks his cousin Don Roland for the loan of his sword Durindana, and how Don Roland refuses to lend it, offering him his company in the difficult enterprise he is undertaking. But he in his valour and anger will not accept it, and says that he alone will suffice to rescue his wife, even though she were imprisoned deep in the centre of the earth, and with this he retires to arm himself and set out on his journey at once. Now let your worships turn your eyes to that tower that appears there, which is supposed to be one of the towers of the Alcazar of Saragossa, now called the Aljaferia. That lady who appears on that balcony dressed in Moorish fashion is the peerless Melisendra, for many a time she used to gaze from thence upon the road to France, and seek consolation in her captivity by thinking of Paris and her husband. Observe, too, a new incident which now occurs, such as, perhaps, never was seen. Do you not see that Moor, who silently and stealthily, with his finger on his lip, approaches Melisendra from behind? Observe now how he prints a kiss upon her lips, and what a hurry she is in to spit, and wipe them with the white sleeve of her smock, and how she bewails herself, and tears her fair hair as though it were to blame for the wrong. Observe, too, that the stately Moor who is in that corridor is King Marsilio of Sansuena, who, having seen the Moor's insolence, at once orders him, though his kinsman and a great favourite of his, to be seized and given 200 lashes, while carried through the streets of the city according to custom, with criers going before him and officers of justice behind. And here you see them come out to execute the sentence, although the offence has been scarcely committed, for among the Moors there are no indictments nor remands as with us. Here Don Quixote called out, "Child, child, go straight on with your story, and don't run into curves and slants, for to establish a fact clearly there is need of a great deal of proof and confirmation. And said Master Pedro from within, "Boy, stick to your text and do as the gentleman bids you. It's the best plan. Keep to your plain song, and don't attempt harmonies, for they are apt to break down from being over fine." "I will," said the boy, and he went on to say, "This figure that you see here on horseback, covered with a Gascon cloak, is Don Gaiferos himself, whom his wife, now avenged of the insult of the amorous Moor, and taking her stand on the balcony of the tower with a calmer and more tranquil countenance, has perceived without recognizing him. And she addresses her husband, supposing him to be some traveller, and holds with him all that conversation and colloquy in the ballad that runs, "If you, Sir Knight, to France are bound, oh, for Gaiferos ask," which I do not repeat here because prolixity begets disgust. Suffice it to observe how Don Gaiferos discovers himself, and that by her joyful gestures Melisendra shows us she has recognized him; and what is more, we now see she lowers herself from the balcony to place herself on the haunches of her good husband's horse. But ah, unhappy lady, the edge of her petticoat has caught on one of the bars of the balcony, and she is left hanging in the air, unable to reach the ground. But you see how compassionate Heaven sends aid in our sorest need. Don Gaiferos advances, and without minding whether the rich petticoat is torn or not, he seizes her and by force brings her to the ground, and then with one jerk places her on the haunches of his horse, astraddle like a man, and bids her hold on tight and clasp her arms about his neck, crossing them on his breast so as not to fall, for the Lady Melisendra was not used to that style of riding. You see, too, how the neighing of the horse shows his satisfaction with the gallant and beautiful burden he bears in his lord and lady. You see how they wheel round and quit the city, and in joy and gladness take the road to Paris. Go in peace, O peerless pair of true lovers! May you reach your longed-for fatherland in safety, and may fortune interpose no impediment on your prosperous journey. May the eyes of your friends and kinsmen behold you enjoying in peace and tranquillity the remaining days of your life, and that they may be as many as those of Nestor." Here Master Pedro called out again and said, "Simplicity, boy! None of your high flights; all affectation is bad." The interpreter made no answer, but went on to say, "There was no want of idle eyes that see everything, to see Melisendra come down and mount, and word was brought to King Marsilio, who at once gave orders to sound the alarm. And see what a stir there is, and how the city is drowned with the sound of bells pealing in the towers of all the mosques." "Nay, nay," said Don Quixote at this, "on that point of the bells Master Pedro is very inaccurate, for bells are not in use among the Moors; only kettle drums, and a kind of a small trumpet somewhat like our clarion. To ring bells this way in Sansuena is unquestionably a great absurdity." On hearing this, Master Pedro stopped ringing, and said, "Don't look into trifles, Señor Don Quixote, or want to have things up to a pitch of perfection that is out of reach. Are there not almost every day 1,000 comedies represented all round us, full of thousands of inaccuracies and absurdities, and, for all that, they have a successful run, and are listened to not only with applause, but with admiration and all the rest of it? Go on, boy, and don't mind; for so long as I fill my pouch, no matter if I show as many inaccuracies as there are motes in a sunbeam." "True enough," said Don Quixote, and the boy went on, "See what a numerous and glittering cloud of horsemen issues from the city in pursuit of the two faithful lovers, what a blowing of trumpets there is, what sounding of horns, what beating of drums and tabors! I fear me they shall overtake them, and bring them back tied to the tail of their own horse, which would be a dreadful sight." Don Quixote, however, seeing such a swarm of Moors and hearing such a din, thought it would be right to aid the fugitives, and standing up he exclaimed in a loud voice, "Never, while I live, will I permit foul play to be practised in my presence on such a famous knight and fearless lover as Don Gaiferos. Halt, ill-born rabble, follow him not nor pursue him, or ye will have to reckon with me in battle." And suiting the action to the word, he drew his sword, and with one bound placed himself close to the show, and with unexampled rapidity and fury began to shower down blows on the puppet troop of Moors, knocking over some, decapitating others, maiming this one and demolishing that. And among many more he delivered one downstroke, which, if Master Pedro had not ducked, made himself small, and got out of the way, would have sliced off his head as easily as if it had been made of almond paste. Master Pedro kept shouting, "Hold hard! Señor Don Quixote! Can't you see they're not real Moors you're knocking down and killing and destroying, but only little pasteboard figures? Look, sinner that I am, how you're wrecking and ruining all that I am worth!" But in spite of this, Don Quixote did not leave off discharging a continuous rain of cuts, slashes, downstrokes, and backstrokes, and at length, in less than a space of 2 credos, he brought the whole show to the ground, with all its fittings and figures shivered and knocked to pieces, King Marsilio badly wounded, and the Emperor Charlemagne with his crown and head split in two. The whole audience was thrown into confusion, the ape fled to the roof of the inn, the cousin was frightened, and even Sancho Panza himself was in mighty fear, for, as he swore after the storm was over, he had never seen his master in such a furious passion. The complete destruction of the show being thus accomplished, Don Quixote became a little calmer, said, "I wish I had here before me now all those who do not or will not believe how useful knights errant are in the world. Just think, if I had not been here present, what would have become of the brave Don Gaiferos and the fair Melisendra? Depend upon it, by this time those dogs would have overtaken them and inflicted some outrage upon them. So then, long live knight-errantry beyond everything living on earth this day." "Let it live and welcome," said Master Pedro at this in a feeble voice, "and let me die, for I am so unfortunate that I can say with King Don Rodrigo, 'Yesterday I was lord of Spain, today I've not a turret left, that I may call mine own. Not half an hour, nay, barely a minute ago, I saw myself lord of kings and emperors, with my stables filled with countless horses, and my trunks and bags with gay dresses unnumbered; and now I find myself ruined and laid low, destitute and a beggar, and above all without my ape, for, by my faith, my teeth will have to sweat for it before I have him caught. And all through the reckless fury of Sir Knight here, who, they say, protects the fatherless, and rights wrongs, and does other charitable deeds, but whose generous intentions have been found wanting in my case only, blessed and praised be the highest heavens. Verily, knight of the rueful figure he must be to have disfigured mine." Sancho Panza was touched by Master Pedro's words, and said to him, "Don't weep and lament, Master Pedro, you break my heart. Let me tell you my master, Don Quixote, is so catholic and scrupulous a Christian that, if he can make out that he has done you any wrong, he will own it, and be willing to pay for it and make it good, and something over and above." "Only let Señor Don Quixote pay me for some part of the work he has destroyed," said Master Pedro, "and I would be content, and his worship would ease his conscience, for he cannot be saved who keeps what is another's against the owner's will, and makes no restitution." "That is true," said Don Quixote, "but at present I am not aware that I have got anything of yours, Master Pedro." "What!" returned Master Pedro, "and these relics lying here on the bare hard ground, what scattered and shattered them but the invincible strength of that mighty arm? And whose were the bodies they belonged to but mine? And what did I get my living by but by them?" "Now I am fully convinced," said Don Quixote, "of what I had many a time before believed, that the enchanters who persecute me do nothing more than put figures like these before my eyes, and then change and turn them into what they please. In truth and earnest, I assure you, gentlemen who now hear me, that to me everything that has taken place here seemed to take place literally, that Melisendra was Melisendra, Don Gaiferos Don Gaiferos, Marsilio Marsilio, and Charlemagne Charlemagne. That was why my anger was roused, and to be faithful to my calling as a knight-errant, I sought to give aid and protection to those who fled, and with this good intention I did what you have seen. If the result has been the opposite of what I intended, it is no fault of mine, but of those wicked beings that persecute me; but, for all that, I am willing to condemn myself in costs for this error of mine, though it did not proceed from malice. Let Master Pedro see what he wants for the spoiled figures, for I agree to pay it at once in good and current money of Castile." Master Pedro made him a bow, saying, "I expected no less of the rare Christianity of the valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha, true helper and protector of all destitute and needy vagabonds. Master landlord here and the great Sancho Panza shall be the arbitrators and appraisers between your worship and me of what these dilapidated figures are worth or may be worth." The landlord and Sancho consented, and then Master Pedro picked up from the ground King Marsilio of Saragossa with his head off, and said, "Here you see how impossible it is to restore this king to his former state, so I think, saving your better judgments, that for his death, decease, and demise, 4 reals and a half may be given me." "Proceed," said Don Quixote. "Well, then, for this cleavage from top to bottom," continued Master Pedro, taking up the split Emperor Charlemagne, "it would not be much if I were to ask 5 reals and a quarter." "It's not little," said Sancho. "Nor is it much," said the landlord; "make it even, and say 5 reals." "Let him have the whole 5 and a quarter," said Don Quixote, "for the sum total of this notable disaster does not stand on a quarter more or less; and make an end of it quickly, Master Pedro, for it's getting on to supper time, and I have some hints of hunger." "For this figure," said Master Pedro, "that is without a nose, and wants an eye, and is the fair Melisendra, I ask, and I am reasonable in my charge, 2 reals and 12 maravedis." "The very devil must be in it," said Don Quixote, "if Melisendra and her husband are not by this time at least on the French border, for the horse they rode on seemed to me to fly rather than gallop; so you needn't try to sell me the cat for the hare, showing me here a noseless Melisendra, when she is now, maybe, enjoying herself at her ease with her husband in France. God help every one to his own, Master Pedro, and let us all proceed fairly and honestly; and now go on." Master Pedro, perceiving that Don Quixote was beginning to wander and return to his original fancy, was not disposed to let him escape, so he said to him, "This cannot be Melisendra, but must be one of the damsels that waited on her; so if I'm given 60 maravedis for her, I'll be content and sufficiently paid." And so he went on, putting values on ever so many more smashed figures, which, after the 2 arbitrators had adjusted them to the satisfaction of both parties, came to 40 reals and 3 quarters; and over and above this sum, which Sancho at once disbursed, Master Pedro asked for 2 reals for his trouble in catching the ape. "Let him have them, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "not to catch the ape, but to get drunk; and 200 would I give this minute for the good news, to anyone who could tell me positively, that the lady Dona Melisendra and Señor Don Gaiferos are now in France and with their own people." "No one could tell us that better than my ape," said Master Pedro, "but there's no devil that could catch him now. I suspect, however, that affection and hunger will drive him to come looking for me tonight; but tomorrow will soon be here, and we shall see." In short, the puppet show storm passed off, and all supped in peace and good fellowship at Don Quixote's expense, for he was the height of generosity. Before it was daylight the man with the lances and halberds took his departure, and soon after daybreak the cousin and the page came to bid Don Quixote farewell, the former returning home, the latter resuming his journey, towards which, to help him, Don Quixote gave him 12 reals. Master Pedro did not care to engage in any more palaver with Don Quixote, whom he knew right well; so he rose before the sun, and having got together the remains of his show and caught his ape, he too went off to seek his adventures. The landlord, who did not know Don Quixote, was as much astonished at his mad freaks as at his generosity. To conclude, Sancho, by his master's orders, paid him very liberally, and taking leave of him they quitted the inn at about 8 in the morning, and took to the road, where we will leave them to pursue their journey, for this is necessary in order to allow certain other matters to be set forth, which are required to clear up this famous history. End of chapters 25 and 26.
Chapter 27 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. Chapter 27, wherein it is shown who Master Pedro and his ape were, together with the mishap Don Quixote had in the braying adventure, which he did not conclude as he would have liked or as he had expected. Sidi Amiti, the chronicler of this great history, begins this chapter with these words: "I swear as a Catholic Christian," with regard to which his translator says that Sidi Hamit's swearing as a Catholic Christian, he being, as no doubt he was, a Moor, only meant that, just as a Catholic Christian taking an oath swears, or ought to swear, what is true, and tell the truth in what he avers, so he was telling the truth, as much as if he swore as a Catholic Christian, in all he chose to write about, Quixote, especially in declaring who Master Pedro was, and what was the divining ape that astonished all the villagers with his divinations. He says then that he who has read the first part of this history will remember well enough the Gines de Pasamonte, whom, with other galley slaves, Don Quixote set free in the Sierra Morena, a kindness for which he afterwards got poor thanks and worse payment from that evil-minded, ill-conditioned set. This Gines de Pasamonte, Don Ginesillo de Parafila, Don Quixote called him. It was that stole Dapple from Sancho Panza, which, because by the fault of the printers neither the how nor the when was stated in the first part, has been a puzzle to a good many people, who attribute to the bad memory of the author what was the error of the press. In fact, however, Gines stole him while Sancho Panza was asleep on his back, adopting the plan and device that Brunello had recourse to when he stole Sacripante's horse from between his legs at the siege of Albraca, and, as has been told, Sancho afterwards recovered him. This Gines then, afraid of being caught by the officers of justice, who were looking for him to punish him for his numberless rascalities and offences, which were so many and so great that he himself wrote a big book giving an account of them, resolved to shift his quarters into the kingdom of Aragon, and cover up his left eye, and take up the trade of a puppet showman, for this, as well as juggling, he knew how to practice to perfection. From some released Christians, returning from Barbary, it so happened, he bought the ape, which he taught to mount upon his shoulder, on his making a certain sign, and to whisper, or seem to do so, in his ear. Thus prepared, before entering any village whither he was bound with his show and his ape, he used to inform himself at the nearest village, or from the most likely person he could find, as to what particular things had happened there, and to whom; and, bearing them well in mind, the first thing he did was to exhibit his show. Sometimes one story, sometimes another, but all lively, amusing, and familiar. As soon as the exhibition was over, he brought forward the accomplishments of his ape, assuring the public that he divined all the past and the present, but as to the future he had no skill. For each question answered he asked 2 reals, and for some he made a reduction, just as he happened to feel the pulse of the questioners. And when, now and then, he came to houses where things that he knew of had happened to the people living there, even if they did not ask him a question, not caring to pay for it, he would make the sign to the ape, and then declare that it had said so and so, which fitted the case exactly. In this way he acquired a prodigious name, and all ran after him. On other occasions, being very crafty, he would answer in such a way that the answers suited the questions, and as no one cross-questioned him, or pressed him to tell how his ape divined, he made fools of them all, and filled his pouch. The instant he entered the inn, he knew Don Quixote and Sancho, and with that knowledge it was easy for him to astonish them and all who were there. But it would have cost him dear had Don Quixote brought down his hand a little lower when he cut off King Marsilio's head and destroyed all his horsemen, as related in the preceding chapter. So much for Master Pedro and his ape. Now to return to Don Quixote of La Mancha. After he had left the inn, he determined to visit, first of all, the banks of the Ebro, and that neighbourhood, before entering the city of Saragossa, for the ample time there was still to spare before the joust left him enough for all. With this object in view, he followed the road, and travelled along it for 2 days, without meeting any adventure worth committing to writing, until on the 3rd day, as he was ascending a hill, he heard a great noise of drums, trumpets, and musket shots. At first he imagined some regiment of soldiers was passing that way, and to see them he spurred Rocinante and mounted the hill. On reaching the top, he saw at the foot of it over 200 men, as it seemed to him, armed with weapons of various sorts, lances, crossbows, partisans, halberds, and pikes, and a few muskets, and a great many bucklers. He descended the slope, and approached the band near enough to see distinctly the flags, make out the colours, and distinguish the devices they bore, especially one on a standard or ensign of white satin, on which there was painted, in a very lifelike style, an ass, like a little sard, with its head up, its mouth open, and its tongue out, as if it were in the act and attitude of braying, and round it were inscribed in large characters these 2 lines: "They did not bray in vain, our Alcaldes twain." From this device Don Quixote concluded that these people must be from the braying town, and he said so to Sancho, explaining to him what was written on the standard. At the same time he observed that the man who had told them about the matter was wrong in saying that the 2 who brayed were regidors, for according to the lines of the standard they were alcaldes. To which Sancho replied, "Señor, there's nothing to stick at that, for maybe the regidors who brayed then came to be alcaldes of their town afterwards, and so they may go by both titles. Moreover, it has nothing to do with the truth of the story whether the brayers were alcaldes or regidors, provided at any rate they did bray, for an alcalde is just as likely to bray as a regidor." They perceived, in short, clearly, that the town which had been twitted had turned out to do battle with some other that had jeered it more than was fair or neighbourly. Don Quixote proceeded to join them, not a little to Sancho's uneasiness, for he never relished mixing himself up in expeditions of that sort. The members of the troop received him into the midst of them, taking him to be someone who was on their side. Don Quixote, putting up his visor, advanced with an easy bearing and demeanour to the standard with the ass, and all the chief men of the army gathered round him to look at him, staring at him with the usual amazement that everybody felt on seeing him for the first time. Don Quixote, seeing them examining him so attentively, and that none of them spoke to him or put any question to him, determined to take advantage of their silence. So, breaking his own, he lifted up his voice and said, "Worthy sirs, I entreat you as earnestly as I can not to interrupt an argument I wish to address to you, until you find it displeases or wearies you, and if that come to pass, on the slightest hint you give me, I will put a seal upon my lips and a gag upon my tongue." They all bade him say what he liked, for they would listen to him willingly. With this permission, Don Quixote went on to say, "I, sirs, am a knight errant, whose calling is that of arms, and whose profession is to protect those who require protection, and give help to such as stand in need of it. Some days ago I became acquainted with your misfortune, and the cause which impels you to take up arms again and again to revenge yourselves upon your enemies, and having many times thought over your business in my mind, I find that, according to the laws of combat, you are mistaken in holding yourselves insulted, For a private individual cannot insult an entire community, unless it be by defying it collectively as a traitor, because he cannot tell who in particular is guilty of the treason for which he defies it. Of this we have an example in Don Diego Ordonez de Lara, who defied the whole town of Zamora, because he did not know that Valido Dolfez alone had committed the treachery of slaying his king, and therefore he defied them all, and the vengeance and the reply concerned all, though to be sure Senor Don Diego went rather too far, indeed very much beyond the limits of a defiance, for he had no occasion to defy the dead, or the waters, or the fishes, or those yet unborn, and all the rest of it as set forth. But let that pass, for when anger breaks out, there's no farther governor or bridle to check the tongue. The case being, then, that no one person can insult a kingdom, province, city, state, or entire community, it is clear that there is no reason for going out to avenge the defiance of such an insult, insomuch as it is not one. A fine thing it would be, if the people of the Clock Town were to be at loggerheads every moment with everyone who called them by that name, all the Cazoleros, Berenjeneros, Balanetos, Jaboneros, or the bearers of all the other names and titles that are always in the mouth of the boys and the common people. It would be a nice business indeed if all these illustrious cities were to take huff and revenge themselves, and go about perpetually making trombones of their swords in every petty quarrel. No, no, God forbid! There are 4 things for which sensible men and well-ordered states ought to take up arms, draw their swords, and risk their persons, lives, and properties. The first is to defend the Catholic faith. The second, to defend one's life, which is in accordance with natural and divine law. The third, in defence of one's honour, family, and property. The fourth, in the service of one's king, in a just war. And if to these we choose to add a fifth, which may be included in the second, in defence of one's country. To these 5, as it were capital causes, there may be added some others that may be just and reasonable, and make it a duty to take up arms. But to take them up for trifles and things to laugh at and be amused by rather than offended, looks as though he did so who was altogether wanting in common sense. Moreover, to take an unjust revenge, and there cannot be any just one, is directly opposed to the sacred law that we acknowledge, wherein we are commanded to do good to our enemies and to love them that hate us. A command which, though it seems somewhat difficult to obey, is only so to those who have in them less of God than of the world, and more of the flesh than of the spirit. For Jesus Christ, God and true man, who never lied, and could not and cannot lie, said, as our lawgiver, that his yoke was easy and his burden light. He would not, therefore, have laid any command upon us that it was impossible to obey. Thus, sirs, you are bound to keep quiet by human and divine law. The devil take me, said Sancho to himself at this, but this master of mine is a theologian, or, if not, faith he's as like one as one egg is like another. Don Quixote stopped to take breath, and observing that silence was still preserved, had a mind to continue his discourse, and would have done so had not Sancho interposed with his smartness. For he, seeing his master pause, took the lead, saying, My lord Don Quixote of La Mancha, who once was called the Knight of the Rueful Countenance, but now is called the Knight of the Lions, is a gentleman of great discretion, who knows Latin and his mother tongue like a bachelor, and in everything that he deals with or advises proceeds like a good soldier, and has all the laws and ordinances of what they call combat at his fingers' ends. Say you have nothing to do but to let yourselves be guided by what he says, and on my head be it if it is wrong. Besides which, you have been told that it is a folly to take offence at merely hearing a bray. I remember, when I was a boy, I brayed as often as I had a fancy, without anyone hindering me, and so elegantly and naturally that when I brayed, all the asses in the town would bray. But I was none the less for that the son of my parents, who were greatly respected, and though I was envied because of my gift, by more than one of the high and mighty ones of the town, I did not care 2 farthings for it, and that you may see I am telling the truth. Wait a bit and listen, for this art, like swimming, once learnt is never forgotten. And then, taking hold of his nose, he began to bray so vigorously that all the valleys around rang again. One of those, however, that stood near him, fancying he was mocking them, lifted up a long staff he had in his hand, and smote him such a blow with it that Sancho dropped helpless to the ground. Don Quixote, seeing him so roughly handled, attacked the man who had struck him, lance in hand, but so many thrust themselves between them that he could not avenge him. Far from it, finding a shower of stones rained upon him, and crossbows and muskets unnumbered levelled at him, he wheeled Rocinante around, and as fast as his best gallop could take him, fled from the midst of them, commending himself to God with all his heart to deliver him out of this peril, in dread every step of some ball coming in at his back and coming out at his breast, and every minute drawing his breath to see whether it had gone from him. The members of the band, however, were satisfied with seeing him take to flight, and did not fire on him. They put up Sancho, scarcely restored to his senses, on his ass, and let him go after his master. Not that he was sufficiently in his wits to guide the beast, but Dapple followed the footsteps of Rocinante, from whom he could not remain a moment separated. Don Quixote, having got some way off, looked back, and seeing Sancho coming, waited for him as he perceived that no one followed him. The men of the troop stood their ground till night, and as the enemy did not come out to battle, they returned to their town, exulting, and had they been aware of the ancient custom of the Greeks, they would have erected a trophy on the spot. Chapter 28. Of matters that Benengeli says, he who reads them will know, if he reads them with attention. When the brave man flees, treachery is manifest, and it is for wise men to reserve themselves for better occasions. This proved to be the case with Don Quixote, who, giving way before the fury of the townfolk and the hostile intentions of the angry troop, took to flight, and without a thought of Sancho or the danger in which he was leaving him, retreated to such a distance as he thought made him safe. Sancho, lying across his ass, followed him, as has been said, and at length came up, having by this time recovered his senses, and on joining him let himself drop off Dapple at Rocinante's feet, sore, bruised, and belaboured. Don Quixote dismounted to examine his wounds, but finding him whole from head to foot, he said to him angrily enough, "In an evil hour didst thou take to braying, Sancho. Where hast thou learned that it is well done to mention the rope in the house of the man that has been hanged? To the music of brays what harmonies couldst thou expect to get but cudgels? Give thanks to God, Sancho, that they signed the cross on thee just now with a stick, and did not mark thee per signum crucis with a cutlass." "I'm not equal to answering," said Sancho, "for I feel as if I was speaking through my shoulders. Let us mount and get away from this. I'll keep from braying, but not from saying that knights errant fly and leave their good squires to be pounded like privet, or made meal of at the hands of their enemies." "He does not fly who retires," returned Don Quixote, "for I would have thee know, Sancho, that the valour which is not based upon a foundation of prudence is called rashness, and the exploits of the rash man are to be attributed rather to good fortune than to courage. And so I own that I retired, but not that I fled, and therein I have followed the example of many valiant men who have reserved themselves for better times. The histories are full of instances of this, but as it would not be any good to thee or pleasure to me, I will not recount them to thee now." Sancho was by this time mounted with the help of Don Quixote, who then himself mounted Rocinante, and at a leisurely pace they proceeded to take shelter in a grove which was in sight about a quarter of a league off. Every now and then Sancho gave vent to deep sighs and dismal groans, and on Don Quixote asking him what caused such acute suffering, he replied that, from the end of his backbone up to the nape of his neck, he was so sore that it nearly drove him out of his senses. "The cause of that soreness," said Don Quixote, "will be, no doubt, that the staff wherewith they smote thee, being a very long one, it caught thee all down the back, where all the parts that are sore are situated, and had it reached any further, thou wouldst be sorer still." "By God," said Sancho, "your worship has relieved me of a great doubt, and cleared up the point for me in elegant style. Body o' me, is the cause of my soreness such a mystery that there's any need to tell me I am sore everywhere the staff hit me? If it was my ankles that pained me, there might be something in going divining why they did, but it is not much to divine that I am sore where they thrashed me. By my faith, master mine, the ills of others hang by a hair. Every day I am discovering more and more how little I have to hope for from keeping company with your worship, for if this time you have allowed me to be drubbed, the next time, or 100 times more, will have the blanketings of the other day over again, and all the other pranks which, if they have fallen on my shoulders now, will be thrown in my teeth by and by. I would do a great deal better, if I was not an ignorant brute that will never do any good all my life, I would do a great deal better, I say, to go home to my wife and children, and support them and bring them up on what God may please to give me, instead of following your worship along roads that lead nowhere and paths that are none at all, with little to drink and less to eat. And then, when it comes to sleeping, measure out 7 feet on the earth, brother squire, and if that's not enough for you, take as many more, for you may have it all your own way and stretch yourself to your heart's content. Oh, that I could see burnt and turned to ashes the first man that meddled with knight-errantry, or at any rate the first who chose to be squires to such fools as all the knight-errants of the past times must have been. Of those of the present day I say nothing, because as your worship is one of them, I respect them, and because I know your worship knows a point more than the devil in all you say and think. I would lay a good wager with you, Sancho, said Don Quixote, that now that you are talking on without anyone to stop you, you don't feel a pain in your whole body. Talk away, my son, say whatever comes into your head or mouth, for so long as you feel no pain, the irritation your impertinences give me will be a pleasure to me. And if you are so anxious to go home to your wife and children, God forbid that I should prevent you. You have money of mine. See how long it is since we left our village this 3rd time, and how much you can and ought to earn every month, and pay yourself out of your own hand. When I worked for Tom Carrasco, the father of bachelor Samson Carrasco, that your worship knows, replied Sancho, I used to earn 2 ducats a month, besides my food. I can't tell what I earn with your worship, though I know a knight-errant squire has harder times of it than he who works for a farmer. For after all, we who work for farmers, however much we toil all day, at the worst, at night we have our olla supper, and sleep in a bed, which I have not slept in since I have been in your worship's service. If it wasn't the short time we were in Don Diego de Miranda's house, and the feast I had with the skimmings I took off Camacho's pots, and what I ate, drank, and slept at Besillo's house, all the rest of the time I have been sleeping on the hard ground, under the open sky, exposed to what they call the inclemencies of heaven, keeping life in me with scraps of cheese and crusts of bread, and drinking water either from the brooks or from the springs that we come to on these bypaths we travel. I own, Sancho, said Don Quixote, that all thou sayest is true. How much thinkest thou ought I to give thee over and above what Tom Carrasco gave thee? I think, said Sancho, that if your worship was to add on 2 reals a month, I'd consider myself well paid. That is as far as the wages of my labour go. But to make up to me for your worship's pledge and promise to me to give me the government of an island, it would be fair to add 6 reals more, making 30 in all." "Very good," said Don Quixote. "It is 25 days since we left our village, so reckon up, Sancho, according to the wages you have made out for yourself, and see how much I owe you in proportion, and pay yourself, as I said before, out of your own hand." "Oh, body, oh me," said Sancho, "but your worship is very much out in that reckoning, for when it comes to the promise of the island, we must count from the day your worship promised it to me to this present hour we are at now." "Well, how long is it, Sancho, since I promised it to you?" said Don Quixote. "If I remember rightly," said Sancho, "it must be over 20 years, 3 days more or less." Don Quixote gave himself a great slap on the forehead, and began to laugh heartily, and said he, "Why, I have not been wandering either in the Sierra Morena or in the whole course of our sallies, but barely 2 months, and thou sayest, Sancho, that it is 20 years since I promised thee the island? I believe now thou wouldst have all the money thou hast of mine go in thy wages. If so, and if that be thy pleasure, I give it to thee now, once and for all, and much good may it do thee, for so long as I see myself rid of such a good-for-nothing squire, I'll be glad to be left a pauper without a rap. But tell me, thou perverter of the squirely rules of knight-errantry, where hast thou ever seen or read that any knight-errant squire made terms with his lord? You must give me so much a month for serving you. Plunge, scoundrel, rogue, monster, for such I take thee to be, plunge, I say, into the mare magnum of their histories, and if thou shalt find that any squire ever said or thought what thou hast said now, I will let thee nail it on my forehead, and give me over and above 4 sound slaps in the face. Turn the rein or the halter of thy dapple, and be gone home, for 1 single step further thou shalt not make in my company. O bread thanklessly received, O promises ill bestowed, O man more beast than human being! Now, when I was about to raise thee to such a position that in spite of thy wife I would call thee my lord, thou art leaving me. Thou art going now, when I had a firm and fixed intention of making thee lord of the best island in the world. Well, as thou hast thyself said before now, honey is not for the mouth of the ass. Ass thou art, ass thou wilt be, and ass thou wilt end when the course of thy life is run, for I know it will come to its close before thou dost perceive or discern that thou art a beast." Sancho regarded Don Quixote earnestly while he was giving him this rating, and was so touched by remorse that the tears came to his eyes, and in a piteous and broken voice he said to him, "Master mine, I confess that, to be a complete ass, all I want is a tail. If your worship will only fix one on me, I'll look on it as rightly placed, and I'll serve you as an ass all the remaining days of my life. Forgive me and have pity on my folly, and remember I know but little, and if I talk much, it's more from infirmity than malice. But he who sins amends commends himself to God." "I should have been surprised, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "if thou hadst not introduced some bit of a proverb into thy speech. Well, well, I forgive thee, provided thou dost mend, and not show thyself in future so fond of thine own interest. But try to be of good cheer, and take good heart, and encourage thyself to look forward to the fulfilment of my promises, which, by being delayed, does not become impossible." Sancho said he would do so, and keep up his heart as best he could. They then entered the grove, and Don Quixote settled himself at the foot of an elm, and Sancho at that of a beech, for trees of this kind and others like them always have feet, but no hands. Sancho passed the night in pain, for with the evening dews the blow of the staff made itself felt all the more. Don Quixote passed it in his never-failing meditations, but for all that they had some winks of sleep, and with the appearance of daylight they pursued their journey in quest of the banks of the famous Ebro, where that befell them which will be told in the following chapter. End of section 15, which is chapters 27 and 28. Section 16 of Don Quixote, Volume 2, that is chapters 29 and 30. Chapters 29 and 30. Chapter 29 of the famous adventure of the enchanted bark. By stages, as already described, or left undescribed, 2 days after quitting the grove, Don Quixote and Sancho reached the river Ebro, and the sight of it was a great delight to Don Quixote, as he contemplated and gazed upon the charms of its banks, the clearness of its stream, the gentleness of its current, and the abundance of its crystal waters. And the pleasant view revived 1,000 tender thoughts in his mind. Above all, he dwelt upon what he had seen in the cave of Montesinos, for although Master Pedro's ape had told him that of those things part was true, part false, he clung more to their truth than to their falsehood, the very reverse of Sancho, who held them all to be downright lies. As they were thus proceeding, then, they discovered a small boat, without oars or any other gear, that lay at the water's edge, tied to the stem of a tree growing on the bank. Don Quixote looked all round, and seeing nobody, at once, without more ado, dismounted from Rocinante, and bade Sancho get down from Dapple, and tie both beasts securely to the trunk of a poplar or willow that stood there. Sancho asked him the reason of this sudden dismounting and tying. Don Quixote made answer, "Thou must know, Sancho, that this bark is plainly, and without the possibility of any alternative, calling and inviting me to enter it, and in it go to give aid to some knight or other person of distinction in need of it, who is no doubt in some sore strait. For this is the way of the books of chivalry, and of the enchanters who figure and speak in them. When a knight is involved in some difficulty from which he cannot be delivered save by the hand of another knight, though they may be at a distance of 2,000 or 3,000 leagues or more one from the other, they either take him up on a cloud, or they provide a bark for him to get into, and in less than the twinkling of an eye they carry him where they will and where his help is required. And so, Sancho, this bark is placed here for the same purpose. This is as true as that it is now day, and ere this one passes, tie Dapple and Rocinante together, and then in God's hand be it to guide us. For I would not hold back from embarking, though barefooted friars were to beg me." "As that's the case," said Sancho, "and your worship chooses to give in to these, I don't know if I may call them absurdities, at every turn, there's nothing for it but to obey and bow the head, bearing in mind the proverb, 'Do as thy master bids me, and sit down to table with him.' But for all that, for the sake of easing my conscience, I warn your worship that it is my opinion that this bark is no enchanted one, but belongs to some of the fishermen of the river, for they catch the best shad in the world here." As Sancho said this, he tied the beasts, leaving them to the care and protection of the enchanters, with sorrow enough in his heart. Don Quixote bade him not be uneasy about deserting the animals, for he who would carry themselves over such longinquous roads and regions would take care to feed them. "I don't understand that logicus," said Sancho, "nor have I ever heard the word all the days of my life." "Longinquus," replied Don Quixote, "means far off, but it is no wonder thou dost not understand it, for thou art not bound to know Latin, like some who pretend to know it and don't." "Now they are tied," said Sancho, "what are we to do next?" "What?" said Don Quixote. cross ourselves and weigh anchor. I mean, embark and cut the moorings by which the bark is held." And the bark began to drift away slowly from the bank. But when Sancho saw himself somewhere about 2 yards out in the river, he began to tremble, and gave himself up for lost. But nothing distressed him more than hearing Dapple bray, and seeing Rocinante struggling to get loose. And said he to his master, "Dapple is braying in grief at our leaving him, and Rocinante is trying to escape, and plunge in after us. Oh, dear friends, peace be with you, and may this madness that is taking us away from you, turned into sober sense, bring us back to you." And with this he fell weeping so bitterly that Don Quixote said to him sharply and angrily, "What art thou afraid of, cowardly creature? What art thou weeping at, heart of butter paste? Who pursues or molests thee, thou soul of a tame mouse? What dost thou want, unsatisfied in the very heart of abundance? Art thou, perchance, tramping barefoot over the Riphaean mountains, instead of being seated on a bench like an archduke on the tranquil stream of this pleasant river, from which, in a short space, we shall come out upon the broad sea? But we must have already emerged and gone 700 or 800 leagues, and if I had here an astrolabe to take the altitude of the pole, I could tell thee how many we have travelled, though either I know little, or we have already crossed, or shall shortly cross, the equinoctial line which parts the two opposite poles midway." "And when we come to that line your worship speaks of," said Sancho, "how far shall we have gone?" "Very far," said Don Quixote, "for of the 360 degrees that this terraqueous globe contains, as computed by Ptolemy, the greatest cosmographer known, we shall have travelled 1/2 when we come to the line I spoke of." "By God," said Sancho, "your worship gives me a nice authority for what you say. Putrid Dolly, something transmogrified, or whatever it is." Don Quixote laughed at the interpretation Sancho put upon computed, and the name of the cosmographer Ptolemy, and said he, "Thou must know, Sancho, that with the Spaniards, and those who embark at Cadiz for the East Indies, one of the signs they have to show them when they have passed the equinoctial line I told thee of, is that the lice die upon everybody on board the ship, and not a single one is left, or to be found in the whole vessel if they gave its weight in gold for it. So, Sancho, thou mayest well pass thy hand down thy thigh, and if thou comest upon anything alive, we shall be no longer in doubt. If not, then we have crossed." "I don't believe a bit of it," said Sancho. "Still, I'll do as your worship bids me, though I don't know what need there is for trying these experiments, for I can see with my own eyes that we have not moved 5 yards away from the bank, or shifted 2 yards from where the animals stand, for there are Rocinante and Dapple in the very same place where we left them, and, watching a point, as I do now, I swear by all that's good, we are not stirring or moving at the pace of an ant." "Try the test I told thee of, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "and don't mind any other, for thou knowest nothing about colures, lines, parallels, zodiacs, ecliptics, poles, solstices, equinoxes, planets, signs, bearings, the measures of which the celestial and terrestrial spheres are composed. If thou wert acquainted with all these things, or any portion of them, thou wouldst see clearly how many parallels we have cut, what signs we have seen, and what constellations we have left behind, and are now leaving behind. But again I tell thee, feel and hunt, for I am certain that thou art cleaner than a sheet of smooth white paper." Sancho felt, and, passing his hand gently and carefully down to the hollow of his left knee, he looked up at his master and said, "Either the test is a false one, or we have not come to where your worship says, nor within many leagues of it." "Why, how so?" asked Don Quixote. "Hast thou come upon aught?" "Ay, and oughts," replied Sancho, and, shaking his fingers, he washed his whole hand in the river along which the boat was quietly gliding in midstream, not moved by any occult intelligence or invisible enchanter, but simply by the current, just there, smooth and gentle. They now came in sight of some large water mills that stood in the middle of the river, and the instant Don Quixote saw them, he cried out, "Seest thou there, my friend? There stands the castle or fortress where there is, no doubt, some knight in durance, or ill-used queen, or infanta, or princess, in whose aid I am brought hither." "What the devil city, fortress, or castle is your worship talking about, señor?" said Sancho. "Don't you see that those are mills that stand in the river to grind corn?" "Hold thy peace, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Though they look like mills, they are not so. I have already told thee that enchantments transform things and change their proper shapes. I do not mean to say they really change them from one form into another, but that it seems as though they did, as experience proved in the transformation of Dulcinea, sole refuge of my hopes." By this time, the boat, having reached the middle of the stream, began to move less slowly than hitherto. The millers belonging to the mills, when they saw the boat coming down the river, and on the point of being sucked in by the draught of the wheels, ran out in haste, several of them with long poles to stop it, and being all mealy, with faces and garments covered with flour, they presented a sinister appearance. They raised loud shouts, crying, "Devils of men, where are you going to? Are you mad? Do you want to drown yourselves or dash yourselves to pieces among these wheels?" "Did I not tell thee, Sancho," said Don Quixote at this, "that we had reached the place where I am to show what the might of my arm can do? See what ruffians and villains come out against me, see what monsters oppose me, see what hideous countenances come to frighten us. You shall soon see, scoundrels." And then standing up in the boat, he began in a loud voice to hurl threats at the millers, exclaiming, "Ill-conditioned and worse-counselled rabble, restore to liberty and freedom the person ye hold in durance in this your fortress or prison, high or low, or of whatever rank or quality he be, for I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, otherwise called the Knight of the Lions, for whom, by the disposition of heaven above, it is reserved to give a happy issue to this adventure." And so saying, he drew his sword, and began making passes in the air at the millers, who, hearing, but not understanding all this nonsense, strove to stop the boat, which was now getting into the rushing channel of the wheels. Sancho fell upon his knees, devoutly appealing to heaven to deliver him from such imminent peril, which it did by the activity and quickness of the millers, who, pushing against the boat with their poles, stopped it, not, however, without upsetting and throwing Don Quixote and Sancho into the water, and lucky it was for Don Quixote that he could swim like a goose, though the weight of his armour carried him twice to the bottom, and had it not been for the millers, who plunged in and hoisted them both out, it would have been Troy town with the pair of them. As soon as, more drenched than thirsty, they were landed, Sancho went down on his knees, and with clasped hands and eyes raised to heaven, prayed a long and fervent prayer to God to deliver him evermore from the rash projects and attempts of his master. The fishermen, the owners of the boat, which the mill wheels had knocked to pieces, now came up, and seeing it smashed, they proceeded to strip Sancho and to demand payment for it from Don Quixote. But he, with great calmness, just as if nothing had happened him, told the millers and fishermen that he would pay for the bark most cheerfully, on condition that they delivered up to him, free and unhurt, the person or persons that were in durance in that castle of theirs. What persons, or what castles art thou talking of, madman? Art thou for carrying off the people who come to grind corn in these mills?" "That's enough," said Don Quixote to himself. It would be preaching in the desert to attempt by entreaties to induce this rabble to do any virtuous action. In this adventure, two mighty enchanters must have encountered one another, and one frustrates what the other attempts. One provided the bark for me, and the other upset me. God help us, this world is all machinations and schemes at cross purposes one with the other. I can do no more." And then turning towards the mills, he said aloud, "Friends, whoe'er ye be that are immured in that prison, forgive me that, to my misfortune and yours, I cannot deliver you from your misery. This adventure is doubtless reserved and destined for some other night." So saying, he settled with the fishermen, and paid 50 reals for the boat, which Sancho handed to them very much against the grain, saying, "With a couple more bark businesses like this, we shall have sunk our whole capital." The fishermen and the millers stood staring in amazement at the two figures, so very different to all appearance from ordinary men, and were wholly unable to make out the drift of the observations and questions Don Quixote addressed to them, and, coming to the conclusion that they were madmen, they left them and betook themselves, the millers to the mills and the fishermen to their huts. Don Quixote and Sancho returned to their beasts and to their life of beasts, and so ended the adventure of the enchanted bark. Chapter 30 of Don Quixote's adventure with a fair huntress. They reached their beasts in low spirits and bad humour enough, knight and squire, Sancho particularly, for with him what touched the stock of money touched his heart, and when any was taken from him, he felt as if he was robbed of the apples of his eyes. In fine, without exchanging a word, they mounted and quitted the famous river, Don Quixote absorbed in thoughts of his love, Sancho in thinking of his advancement, which just then, it seemed to him, he was very far from securing, for, fool as he was, he saw clearly enough that his master's acts were all, or most of them, utterly senseless, and he began to cast about for an opportunity of retiring from his service and going home some day without entering into any explanations or taking any farewell of him. Fortune, however, ordered matters after a fashion very much the opposite of what he contemplated. It so happened that the next day, towards sunset, on coming out of a wood, Don Quixote cast his eyes over a green meadow, and at the far end of it observed some people, and as he drew nearer saw that it was a hawking party. Coming closer, he distinguished among them a lady of graceful mien, on a pure white palfrey, or hackney, caparisoned with green trappings and a silver-mounted side-saddle. The lady was also in green, and so richly and splendidly dressed that splendour itself seemed personified in her. On her left hand she bore a hawk, a proof to Don Quixote's mind that she must be some great lady and the mistress of the whole hunting party, which was the fact. So he said to Sancho, "Run, Sancho, my son, and say to that lady on the palfrey with the hawk that I, the Knight of the Lions, kiss the hands of her exalted beauty, and if her excellence will grant me my leave, I will go and kiss them in person, and place myself at her service for aught that may be in my power and her highness may command. And mind, Sancho, how thou speakest, and take care not to thrust in any of thy proverbs into thy message." "You've got a likely one here to thrust any in," said Sancho. "Leave me alone for that. Why, this is not the first time in my life I have carried messages to high and exalted ladies." "Except that thou didst carry to the lady Dulcinea," said Don Quixote. "I know not that thou hast carried any other, at least in my service." "That is true," replied Sancho, "but pledges don't distress a good payer, and in a house where there's plenty supper is soon cooked. I mean, there's no need of telling or warning me about anything, for I'm ready for everything and know a little of everything." "That I believe, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Go, and good luck to thee, and God speed thee." Sancho went off at top speed, forcing Dapple out of his regular pace, and came to where the fair huntress was standing, and, dismounting, knelt before her and said, "Fair lady, that knight that you see there, the Knight of the Lions by name, is my master, and I am the squire of his, and at home they call me Sancho Panza. This same Knight of the Lions, who was called not long since the Knight of the Rueful Countenance, sends by me to say may it please your highness to give him leave that, with your permission, approbation, and consent, he may come and carry out his wishes, which are, as he says, and I believe, to serve your exalted loftiness and beauty, and, if you give it, your ladyship will do a thing which will redound to your honour, and he will receive a most distinguished favour and happiness." "You have indeed, squire," said the lady, "delivered your message with all the formalities such messages require. Rise up, for it is not right that the squire of a knight so great as he of the Rueful Countenance, of whom we have heard a great deal here, should remain on his knees. Rise, my friend, and bid your master welcome to the services of myself and the duke my husband, in a country house we have here." Sancho got up, charmed as much by the beauty of the good lady as by her high-bred air and her courtesy, but, above all, by what she had said about having heard of his master, the Knight of the Rueful Countenance; for if she did not call him Knight of the Lions, it was no doubt because he had so lately taken the name. "Tell me, brother squire," asked the Duchess, whose title, however, is not known, "this master of yours, is he not one of whom there is a history extant in print, called the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, who has for the lady of his heart a certain Dulcinea del Toboso?" "He is the same, señora," replied Sancho, "and that squire of his who figures, or ought to figure, in the said history under the name of Sancho Panza is myself, unless they have changed me in the cradle, I mean in the press." "I am rejoiced at all this," said the Duchess. "Go, brother Panza, and tell your master that he is welcome to my estate, and that nothing could happen me that could give me greater pleasure." Sancho returned to his master, mightily pleased with this gratifying answer, and told him all the great lady had said to him, lauding to the skies, in his rustic phrase, her rare beauty, her graceful gaiety, and her courtesy. Don Quixote drew himself up briskly in his saddle, fixed himself in his stirrups, settled his visor, gave Rocinante the spur, and with an easy bearing advanced to kiss the hands of the Duchess, who, having sent to summon the duke her husband, told him while Don Quixote was approaching all about the message, and as both of them had read the first part of this history, and from it were aware of Don Quixote's crazy turn, they awaited him with the greatest delight and anxiety to make his acquaintance, meaning to fall in with his humour and agree with everything he said, and, so long as he stayed with them, to treat him as a knight-errant, with all the ceremonies usual in the books of chivalry they had read, for they themselves were very fond of them. Don Quixote now came up with his visor raised, and, as he seemed about to dismount, Sancho made haste to go and hold his stirrup for him. But, in getting down off Dapple, he was so unlucky as to hitch his foot in one of the ropes of the pack-saddle in such a way that he was unable to free it, and was left hanging by it with his face and breast to the ground. Don Quixote, who was not used to dismount without having the stirrup held, fancying that Sancho had by this time come to hold it for him, threw himself off with a lurch and brought Rocinante's saddle after him, which was no doubt badly girthed, and saddle and he both came to the ground, not without discomfiture to him, and abundant curses muttered between his teeth against the unlucky Sancho, who had his foot still in the shackles. The duke ordered his huntsman to go to the help of knight and squire, and they raised Don Quixote, sorely shaken by his fall, and he, limping, advanced as best he could to kneel before the noble pair. This, however, the duke would by no means permit. On the contrary, dismounting from his horse, he went and embraced Don Quixote, saying, "I am grieved, Sir Knight of the Rueful Countenance, that your first experience of my ground should have been such an unfortunate one as we have seen, but the carelessness of squires is often the cause of worse accidents." "That which has happened me in meeting you, mighty prince," replied Don Quixote, "cannot be unfortunate, even if my fall had not stopped short of the depths of the bottomless pit, for the glory of having seen you would have lifted me up and delivered me from it. My squire, God's curse upon him, is better at unloosing his tongue in talking impertinence than in tightening the girths of a saddle to keep it steady. But, however I may be, Allen or raised up, on foot or on horseback, I shall always be at your service and that of my lady the Duchess, your worthy consort, worthy queen of beauty and paramount princess of courtesy." "Gently, Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha," said the duke. "Where my lady Dona Dulcinea del Toboso is, it is not right that other beauties should be praised." Sancho, by this time released from his entanglement, was standing by, and before his master could answer he said, "There is no denying, and it must be maintained, that my lady Dulcinea del Toboso is very beautiful, but the hair jumps up where one least expects it, and I have heard say that what we call nature is like a potter that makes vessels of clay, and he who makes one fair vessel can as well make 2 or 3 or 100. I say so because, by my faith, my lady the Duchess is in no way behind my mistress the lady Dulcinea del Toboso." Don Quixote turned to the Duchess and said, "Your highness may conceive that never had knight-errant in this world a more talkative or a droller squire than I have, and he will prove the truth of what I say if your highness is pleased to accept of my services for a few days." To which the Duchess made answer, "That worthy Sancho is droll I consider a very good thing, because it is a sign that he is shrewd, for drollery and sprightliness, Señor Don Quixote, as you very well know, do not take up their abode with dull wits, and as good Sancho is droll and sprightly, I here set him down as shrewd." "And talkative," added Don Quixote. "So much the better," said the duke, "for many droll things cannot be said in few words. But not to lose time in talking, come, great knight of the Rueful Countenance." "Of the lions, your highness must say," said Sancho, "for there is no Rueful Countenance, nor any such character now." "He of the lions be it," continued the duke. "I say, let Sir Knight of the Lions come to a castle of mine close by, where he shall be given the reception which is due so exalted a personage, and which the Duchess and I are wont to give to all knights errant who come here." By this time Sancho had fixed and girthed Rocinante's saddle, and Don Quixote having got on his back, and the duke mounted a fine horse, they placed the Duchess in the middle and set out for the castle. The Duchess desired Sancho to come to her side, for she found infinite enjoyment in listening to his shrewd remarks. Sancho required no pressing, but pushed himself in between them and the duke, who thought it rare good fortune to receive such a knight-errant and such a homely squire in their castle. End of Chapter 30. And end of Section 16.
Chapter 31 of Don Quixote, Volume 2. Chapter 31, which treats of many and great matters. Supreme was the satisfaction that Sancho felt at seeing himself, as it seemed, an established favourite with the duchess, for he looked forward to finding in her castle what he had found in Don Diego's house and in Basilio's. He was always fond of good living, and always seized by the forelock any opportunity of feasting himself whenever it presented itself. The history informs us, then, that before they reached the country house or castle, the duke went on in advance and instructed all his servants how they were to treat Don Quixote, and so the instant he came up to the castle gates with the duchess, 2 lackeys or equerries, clad in what they call morning gowns of fine crimson satin reaching to their feet, hastened out, and catching Don Quixote in their arms before he saw or heard them, said to him, "Your highness should go and take my lady the duchess off her horse." Don Quixote obeyed, and great bandying of compliments followed between the two over the matter, but in the end the duchess's determination carried the day, and she refused to get down or dismount from her palfrey except in the arms of the duke, saying she did not consider herself worthy to impose so unnecessary a burden on so great a knight. At length the duke came out to take her down, and as they entered a spacious court 2 fair damsels came forward and threw over Don Quixote's shoulders a large mantle of the finest scarlet cloth, and at the same instant all the galleries of the court were lined with the men servants and women servants of the household, crying, "Welcome, flower and cream of knight-errantry," while all or most of them flung pellets filled with scented water over Don Quixote and the duke and duchess. At all which Don Quixote was greatly astonished, and this was the first time that he thoroughly felt and believed himself to be a knight-errant in reality and not merely in fancy, now that he saw himself treated in the same way as he had read of such knights being treated in days of yore. Sancho, deserting Dapple, hung on to the duchess and entered the castle, but feeling some twinges of conscience at having left the ass alone, he approached a respectable duenna who had come out with the rest to receive the duchess, and in a low voice he said to her, "Señora Gonzalez, or however your grace may be called." "I am called Doña Rodriguez de Grijalba," replied the duenna. "What is your will, brother?" To which Sancho made answer, "I should be glad if your worship would do me the favour to go out to the castle gate, where you will find a grey ass of mine. Make them, if you please, put him in the stable, or put him there yourself, for the poor little beast is rather easily frightened, and cannot bear being alone at all." "If the master is as wise as the man," said the duenna, "we have got a fine bargain. Be off with you, brother, and bad luck to you and him who brought you here. Go, look after your ass, for we, the duennas of this house, are not used to work of that sort." "Well then, in troth," returned Sancho, "I have heard my master, who is the very treasure finder of stories, telling the story of Lancelot when he came from Britain, say that ladies waited upon him and duennas upon his hack, and, if it comes to my ass, I shouldn't change him for Señor Lancelot's hack." "If you are a jester, brother," said the duenna, "keep your drolleries for some place where they'll pass muster and be paid for you'll get nothing from me but a fig." "At any rate it will be a very ripe one," said Sancho, "for you won't lose the trick in years by a point too little." "Son of a bitch," said the duenna, all aglow with anger, "whether I'm old or not, it's with God I have to reckon, not with you, you garlic-stuffed scoundrel." And she said it so loud that the duchess heard it, and turning around and seeing the duenna in such a state of excitement, and her eyes flaming so, asked whom she was wrangling with. "With this good fellow here," said the duenna, "who has particularly requested me to go and put an ass of his that is in the castle gate into the stable, holding it up to me as an example that they did the same I don't know where, that some ladies waited on one Lancelot, and duennas on his hack, and what is more, to wind up with, he called me old." "That," said the duchess, "I should have considered the greatest affront that could be offered me," and addressing Sancho, she said to him, "You must know, friend Sancho, that Doña Rodriguez is very youthful, and that she wears that hood more for authority and custom's sake than because of her years." "May all the rest of mine be unlucky," said Sancho, "if I meant it that way. I only spoke because the affection I have for my ass is so great, and I thought I could not commend him to a more kind-hearted person than the lady Doña Rodriguez." Don Quixote, who was listening, said to him, "Is this proper conversation for the place, Sancho?" "Señor," replied Sancho, "every one must mention what he wants wherever he may be. I thought of Dapple here, and I spoke of him here. If I had thought of him in the stable, I would have spoken there." Of which the duke observed, "Sancho is quite right, and there is no reason at all to find fault with him. Dapple shall be fed to his heart's content, and Sancho may rest easy, for he shall be treated like himself." While this conversation, amusing to all except Don Quixote, was proceeding, they ascended the staircase and ushered Don Quixote into a chamber hung with rich cloth of gold and brocade. 6 damsels relieved him of his armour and waited on him like pages, all of them prepared and instructed by the duke and duchess as to what they were to do, and how they were to treat Don Quixote, so that he might see and believe they were treating him like a knight errant. When his armour was removed, there stood Don Quixote in his tight-fitting breeches and chamois doublet, lean, lanky, and long, with cheeks that seemed to be kissing each other inside, such a figure that if the damsels waiting on him had not taken care to check their merriment, which was one of the particular directions their master and mistress had given them, they would have burst with laughter. They asked him to let himself be stripped that they might put a shirt on him, but he would not on any account, saying that modesty became knight-errant just as much as valour. However, he said they might give the shirt to Sancho, and shutting himself in with him in a room where there was a sumptuous bed, he undressed and put on the shirt, and then, finding himself alone with Sancho, he said to him, "Tell me, thou new-fledged buffoon and old booby, dost thou think it right to offend and insult a duenna so deserving of reverence and respect as that one just now? Was that a time to bethink thee of thy Dapple, or are these noble personages likely to let the beasts fare badly when they treat their owners in such elegant style? For God's sake, Sancho, restrain thyself, and don't show the thread so as to let them see what a coarse, boorish texture thou art of. Remember, sinner that thou art, the master is more esteemed the more respectable and well-bred his servants are, and that one of the greatest advantages that princes have over other men is that they have servants as good as themselves to wait on them. Dost thou not see, short-sighted being that thou art, and unlucky mortal that I am, that if they perceive thee to be a coarse clown or a dull blockhead, they will suspect me to be some impostor or swindler? Nay, nay, Sancho friend, keep clear, oh, keep clear of these stumbling blocks, for he who falls into the way of being a chatterbox and droll drops into a wretched buffoon the first time he trips. Bridle thy tongue, consider and weigh thy words before they escape thy mouth, and bear in mind we are now in quarters whence, by God's help and the strength of my arm, we shall come forth mightily advanced in fame and fortune." Sancho promised him with much earnestness to keep his mouth shut, and to bite off his tongue before he uttered a word that was not altogether to the purpose and well considered, and told him he might make his mind easy on that point, for it should never be discovered through him what they were. Don Quixote dressed himself, put on his baldric with his sword, threw the scarlet mantle over his shoulders, placed on his head a montera of green satin that the damsels had given him, and thus arrayed passed out into the large room, where he found the damsels drawn up in double file, the same number on each side, with all the appliances for washing the hands, which they presented to him with profuse obeisances and ceremonies. Then came 12 pages, together with the seneschal, to lead him to dinner, as his hosts were already waiting for him. They placed him in the midst of them, and with much pomp and stateliness they conducted him into another room, where there was a sumptuous table laid with but 4 covers. The duchess and the duke came out to the door of the room to receive him, and with them a grave ecclesiastic, one of those who rule noblemen's houses, one of those who, not being born magnates themselves, never know how to teach those who are how to behave as such, one of those who would have the greatness of great folk measured by their own narrowness of mind, one of those who, when they try to introduce economy into the household they rule, lead it into meanness. One of this sort, I say, must have been the grave churchman who came out with the duke and duchess to receive Don Quixote. A vast number of polite speeches were exchanged, and at length, taking Don Quixote between them, they proceeded to sit down to table. The duke pressed Don Quixote to take the head of the table, and, though he refused, the entreaties of the duke were so urgent that he had to accept it. The ecclesiastic took his seat opposite to him, and the duke and duchess those at the sides. All this time Sancho stood by, gaping with amazement at the honour he saw shown to his master by these illustrious persons, and observing all the ceremonious pressing that had passed between the duke and Don Quixote to induce him to take his seat at the head of the table, he said, "If your worship will give me leave, I will tell you a story of what happened in my village about this matter of seats." The moment Sancho said this Don Quixote trembled, making sure that he was about to say something foolish. Sancho glanced at him, and guessing his thoughts, said, "Don't be afraid of my going astray, señor, or saying anything that won't be pat to the purpose. I haven't forgotten the advice your worship gave me just now about talking much or little, well or ill." "I have no recollection of anything, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Say what thou wilt, only say it quickly." "Well then," said Sancho, "what I am going to say is so true that my master Don Quixote, who is here present, will keep me from lying." "Lie as much as thou wilt for all I care, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "for I am not going to stop thee, but consider what thou art going to say." "I have so considered and reconsidered," said Sancho, "that the bell ringer's in a safe berth, as will be seen by what follows." "It would be well," said Don Quixote, "if your highnesses would order them to turn out this idiot, for he will talk a heap of nonsense." "By the life of the duke, Sancho shall not be taken away from me for a moment," said the duchess. "I am very fond of him, for I know he is very discreet." "Discreet be the days of your holiness," said Sancho, "for the good opinion you have of my wit, though there's none in me, but the story I want to tell is this. There was an invitation given by a gentleman of my town, a very rich one, and one of quality, for he was one of the Alamos of Medina del Campo, and married to Doña Mencia de Quinones, the daughter of Don Alonso de Maranon, knight of the order of Santiago, that was drowned at the Herradura. Him there was that quarrel about years ago in our village, that my master Don Quixote was mixed up in, to the best of my belief, that Tomasillo the scapegrace, the son of Balbastro the smith, was wounded in. Isn't all this true, master mine? As you live, say so, that these gentlefolk may not take me for some lying chatterer." "So far," said the ecclesiastic, "I take you to be more a chatterer than a liar, but I don't know what I shall take you for by and by." "Thou citest so many witnesses and proofs, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "that I have no choice but to say thou must be telling the truth. Go on, and cut the story short, for thou art taking the way, not to make an end for 2 days to come." "He is not to cut it short," said the duchess. "On the contrary, for my gratification, he is to tell it as he knows it, though he should not finish it these 6 days; and if he took so many, they would be to me the pleasantest I ever spent." "Well then, sirs, I say," continued Sancho, "that this same gentleman, whom I know as well as I do my own hands, for it's not a bow shot from my house to his, invited a poor but respectable labourer—" "Get on, brother," said the churchman. "At the rate you are going you will not stop with your story short of the next world." "I'll stop less than half-way, please God," said Sancho, "and so I say this labourer, coming to the house of the gentleman I spoke of that invited him, rest his soul, he is now dead, and more by token he died the death of an angel, so they say, for I was not there, for just at that time I had gone to reap at Tembleque." "As you live, my son," said the churchman, "make haste back from Tembleque and finish your story without burying the gentleman, unless you want to make more funerals." "Well then, it so happened," said Sancho, "that as the pair of them were going to sit down to table, and I think I see them now plainer than ever—" Great was the enjoyment the duke and duchess derived from the irritation the worthy churchman showed at the long-winded, halting way Sancho had of telling his story, while Don Quixote was chafing with rage and vexation. "So as I was saying," continued Sancho, "as the pair of them were going to sit down to table, as I said, the labourer insisted upon the gentleman's taking the head of the table, and the gentleman insisted on the labourer's taking it, as his orders should be obeyed in his house; but the labourer, who plumed himself on his politeness and good breeding, would not on any account, until the gentleman, out of patience, putting his hands on his shoulders, compelled him by force to sit down, saying, 'Sit down, you stupid lout, for wherever I sit will be the head to you;' and that's the story, and, troth, I think it hasn't been brought in amiss here." Don Quixote turned all colours, which, on his sunburned face, mottled it till it looked like jasper. The duke and duchess suppressed their laughter so as not altogether to mortify Don Quixote, for they saw through Sancho's impertinence; And to change the conversation, and keep Sancho from uttering more absurdities, the duchess asked Don Quixote what news he had of the lady Dulcinea, and if he had sent her any presents of giants or miscreants lately, for he could not but have vanquished a good many. To which Don Quixote replied, "Señora, my misfortunes, though they had a beginning, will never have an end. I have vanquished giants, and I have sent her caitiffs and miscreants. But where are they to find her if she is enchanted and turned into the most ill-favoured peasant wench that can be imagined?" "I don't know," said Sancho Panza. "To me she seems the fairest creature in the world. At any rate, in nimbleness and jumping, she won't give in to a tumbler. By my faith, Señora Duchess, she leaps from the ground on to the back of an ass like a cat." "Have you seen her enchanted, Sancho?" asked the duke. "What, seen her?" said Sancho. "Why, who the devil was it but myself that first thought of the enchantment business? She is as much enchanted as my father." The ecclesiastic, when he heard them talking of giants and caitiffs and enchantments, began to suspect that this must be Don Quixote of La Mancha, whose story the duke was always reading, and he had himself often reproved him for it, telling him it was foolish to read such fooleries, and becoming convinced that his suspicion was correct, addressing the duke, he said very angrily to him, "Señor, your excellence will have to give account to God for what this good man does. This Don Quixote, or Don Simpleton, or whatever his name is, cannot, I imagine, be such a blockhead as your excellence would have him, holding out encouragement to him to go on with his vagaries and follies." Then, turning to address Don Quixote, he said, "And you, numbskull, who put it in your head that you are a knight errant, and vanquish giants and capture miscreants? Go your ways in a good hour, and in a good hour be it said to you. Go home, and bring up your children if you have any, and attend to your business, and give over going wandering about the world, gaping and making a laughing-stock of yourself to all who know you and all who don't. Where, in heaven's name, have you discovered that there are or ever were knights errant? Where are the giants in Spain, or miscreants in La Mancha, or enchanted Dulcineas, or the rest of the silly things they tell about you?" Don Quixote listened attentively to the reverend gentleman's words, and as soon as he perceived he had done speaking, regardless of the presence of duke and duchess, he sprang to his feet with angry looks and an agitated countenance, and said, but the reply deserves a chapter to itself. Chapter 32.